Welcome to Psyched for Psychology, a Nystrom Associates podcast. Our hosts, Michelle Iversen and Brett Cushing, are both licensed marriage and family therapists at Nystrom Associates. Each week, they talk about all things mental health and therapy, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, here are your hosts, Michelle and Brett.
Hello and welcome to this Facebook Live event. My name is Brett Cushing and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
And I'm Michelle Iversen. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist, and we both work at Nystrom Associates. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are doing a really special talk today on the topic of vulnerability. But what me and Brett are incredibly excited to do today is to introduce you to us as the new co-hosts for Nystrom's brand new podcast called Psyched for Psychology. This is a new podcast being launched by Nystrom Associates. In joining us today, you are going to get to find out a little bit more about us and about the topics that we get to talk about every week to you that just make us and Nystrom psyched to do what we do best. And for us, it's about being able to make a positive dent in the universe and changing lives. So please join us as we do our very first live podcast today. And we are going to be talking about the benefits of vulnerability. You can also learn more about us and our services by visiting our website at nystromcounseling.com. Well, to kick us off, Brett, what do you think is really important for us when we think about that word vulnerability and how it applies to us today?
Well, vulnerability is something we can all relate to, right? Yes. I mean, we all kind of fear being vulnerable, right? You and I, we are feeling a little bit vulnerable right now with everybody on this live event. And so we all can relate to it. And think about it on a macro level. Vulnerability, it hits us all the time. We just got over, on a macro level, something we all felt very vulnerable about, and that was COVID. And then that was immediately followed up with the Ukraine war and the vulnerabilities that we're experiencing even with that. And that there's kind of that old adage in the news, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And part of the reason for that is because on a macro level, that kind of hits us right in that sense of vulnerability. So we can relate to this on a macro level.
Absolutely. And I really kind of noticed that we kind of find our vulnerabilities, they happen the most when we're in times of stress, right? Times of duress. But also when we're just with others that we care about, or when we really want to get closer to other people and we don't know how. In the face of everything happening in the world, but even just in our relationships, even in the best of times, it can be really tempting to want to be a person who really wants to appear as being strong, being perfect, being smart. I mean, who doesn't? As we're talking about the vulnerability of starting a podcast, I'm sure Brett and myself both have had many times in which we're like, this podcast has to be perfect. It has to go perfect. And at the same time, when we do that to ourselves, that can also potentially create this underlying fear of rejection. What would happen to me if other people saw me for who I really am?
And I think it is something on a personal level that we can relate to, whether it's in our family environment or even in our work environments, and unfortunately in both, because we sometimes are experiencing chronic environments of invalidation when we don't know, when am I going to be criticized next? I'm only as good as my last mistake. And we carry that weight of unpredictability of when I'm going to be judged again. And so it is something on a macro level to a very personal level and interpersonal level. We really can relate to this, and that's why we wanted to use this topic to begin with, because we're living it out right now.
Yes, we are. And we can become really easily afraid, right? Nobody likes unpredictability. Nobody likes anxiety. It causes discomfort. But if we don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable with other people, that keeps us from being seen by those people that we care about the most. So what if we were to lean into that discomfort when it makes sense to, right? And use that as a really great opportunity to grow.
And that's great to think about, but it's also scary too. It's scary to lean into vulnerability. It's scary for us to be vulnerable. And so it makes sense because what we're concerned about is that we're going to be exposed. People are going to see us and they're not going to like what they see. I remember there's a book, I used to have it on my bookshelf. It's from the 70s, big long title, Why I'm Afraid to Tell You Who I Really Am. And the answer to that is, if I tell you who I really am, well, that's all I've got. And if you reject that, that's all I've got. And so a lot of times really what we're afraid of, and the reason we avoid vulnerability is because we're afraid of judgment from other people. In fact, I don't know if a lot of people realize the number one thing people look for in a relationship is safety, where they're not going to be judged by other people. And so while vulnerability serves as a means to protect us, we want to also highlight that vulnerability can be a means to provide for us. So let me talk a little bit about how vulnerability enables us to and provides for us opportunities. First of all, it builds trust and intimacy in relationships. And that's scary business, right? Intimacy is hard. But when you think about it, when there's no vulnerability, and I don't let you or anybody else see the real me or parts of me, when there's no vulnerability, there's no real ultimate knowability. You don't really know me. You just see this exterior for me. And in contrast to that, knowability, when people can know us, knowability leads to intimacy, and it leads to connectivity with one another. And so I think of like the illustration like we of dogs, because like I've seen videos where dogs, they haven't seen their owner like in a year. I saw this one, it was great. It was a guy, he had shaved and he lost a ton of weight, hadn't seen his dog in like a year. And so his dog sees this new person whom he'd never seen before, he thought, and he was very guarded. And the dog was very hesitant. And then as the owner kind of came up, the dog was able to sniff and realize the scent. And suddenly, the dog went bananas. I mean, it just went ballistic. It was so excited and it was uninhibited, right? And so we're open to the known. I think this really illustrates how we are open to things that are known, and we protect ourselves from the things that are unknown. That's just what that dog was doing, and that's just what we do as well. But when we realize that vulnerability serves as a means to build trust and intimacy, it allows that connectivity. It allows that inhibited full expression of ourselves and a depth of intimacy in our relationships.
Right. Can I tell you a little bit about a story that I like to tell all my clients? So to really kind of get an understanding of that idea of like, well, I have to be vulnerable to be known. Like, what do you mean? I would tell a lot for my clients this story, and I would tell them about this man who, he has one friend, and he goes to his friend, he's like, I want to know more people, right? And I want to be known by more people. I want to have more friends, right? Expand my circle. And he goes to his one friend and says, what on earth am I going to do? And his friend's like, well, here's the deal. There's a village right down the road. Go right down to the village, right? I know all the people there. They are amazing. They are friendly. They are warm. Just go down there and go say hi. It will go well. But as the man is thinking about this, he starts to get very anxious. He starts to develop that fear of rejection. What if they don't like me, right? And as he's developing and this fear is starting to build and the anxiety starts to build, he decides, well, I've got to protect myself. So I'm going to get some things, right? I'm going to get my hunting dogs. I'm going to get my sword. I'm going to get my shield. I'm going to take them all with me. I'm going to go sit in the middle of that village, right? And wait for people to come to me. And what do you think happened, Brett?
Yeah, I can imagine it was not a magnet for people.
No. Can you imagine this guy sitting down there like he's prepared for war, right? And all he wanted to do really was make a friend, right? And so we talk with clients about that idea of like, what are your dogs and swords and shields that you're putting up as this protection, but then at the same time, keeping people away from you?
Absolutely, because we're that the great powerful parable, we have someone so prepared to protect oneself and so inhibited from the provisions that vulnerability provides. And so it's really a tragic story because that's what so many of us do, and we end up isolated. We want you to see that vulnerability can be a friend. It really can be, because it builds that trust, it builds intimacy, it builds connectivity, and when we are vulnerable, it's very liberating for us. Because think of all the work and all the effort and all the strain that went into that man carrying all of that and organizing everything, and just the burden of all those what if questions that were really weighing him down. But when we can embrace vulnerability at opportune times when it's appropriate, it becomes so liberating for us as well. So I remember a story. I did shot put in high school. I wasn't very good, okay? The only thing I was good at was kind of grunting really loud. I was really good at that. And when guys are doing shot put, they're kind of, and they're grunting and they're groaning and they're trying to be all this puffy chested kind of thing. And we had this shot put and it was empty. It was just plastic, but nobody knew that. And so this was my moment to shine. And so I did my grunting thing. That's what I'm good at. And everyone's quiet. They're all watching me because I'm a good grunter. And so then I heaved this thing up in the air and it went like a country mile up in the air, 2 miles long, and the whole place was just hushed. They could not believe this supernatural strength until the shot put finally lands and it just goes dink, 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 and then everybody realized it was empty. And everybody laughed, and there was this sense of relief, right? And everyone was just sort of like, yeah, look at what we're all doing. We're all kind of showing off here, and we're all kind of putting on our best face, and nobody was really being vulnerable. And after that happened, we were actually all able to laugh and connect a little bit. And you know what? It's not just shooting the shot, but that's what it's like at some of our family holiday events. That's what it's like in the office. We're not grunting and groaning, but we're putting our best foot forward and not letting people see the real us. And we carry that weight. And when we can let go of that, it's incredibly liberating for ourselves and other people around us.
And there's been so much research into this, and it shows over and over and over again, we love for people to be authentic, right? And we hope that we can be authentic with others too, right? We want us, and we want the people that we care about to feel real. But if we buy into that myth, that idea of, I always need to be strong and perfect and smart and capable, right? Whatever it's saying, then research says that we're really actually at risk of the opposite, of coming across as being inauthentic, right? Even to those safe people, those people that we really, really care about. That armor that we talked about earlier with that story, right? That armor makes us feel like we're in control, but sometimes that can do more harm than good.
Sometimes being in control is not the best thing. As much as I yearn for it, it's not the best thing. And that control, again, speaks to the one aspect of vulnerability that is aimed at protecting us, okay? But it can get in the way of providing for us that sense of connection. But I think the difficulty is, how do I know?
Yes.
How do I know when do I go into protection mode?
Right.
When do I go into provision mode? And think of it this way, using vulnerability as an ally, right? As an ally to protect myself and an ally to provide something for myself. So if we can think of it in kind of this balanced, dialectical way, vulnerability is not so scary. It's really an ally I can tap into. But the question is, how do I know?
How do you know? That was what I was going to ask you, Brad, is how would you know that this is going to be the time, the place, the person to be vulnerable versus not?
Well, it's a good question, and it's hard because the tragedy is that so many of us, we want to be known.
Yeah.
And we want to know other people, and we want to be known. And so everybody, I think, wants this connection, and everybody is afraid of it at the same time. So how do we know it? I'll use my answer in form of an illustration, okay? I remember being at hotels growing up, and there was always a pool, and it always seemed cold, too cold. And so how do you determine if the water is right? Well, I determined, sometimes I was really brave, and I would just jump into the deep end, right? More often than not, my big brothers, Doug and Tim, would grab me and just throw me into the deep end, okay?
That's what they're good for.
Yeah, it's about all they were good for, I think. And however, it was kind of a shock to the system when you just go into the deep end and you're there and you're like, oh my, this is really cold. I got to get out of here, or I just have to endure it, right? And that's how a lot of times we go in to relationships. We're so eager for that connection, and we just go all in. And suddenly it's a shock to the system. We're scared. We're like, I got to get out of here, or I just have to endure this work situation, relationship, family dynamics until I can maybe acclimate. Now that I'm older, I go into pools a little bit differently. I go into a pool where I walk in, I go by the steps and that handrail, and I kind of put my toes in and I see what's the temperature of the water here. Yeah. And if my toes are saying, hey, this is all right, I can go a little bit further. So in other words, if the water is reciprocating that it's warm and it's comfortable for me, I pay attention to my comfort level, and then I go a little bit further. And as long as the water continually reciprocates back to me, that's an inclination I can keep on going. And I think similarly, that's how we need to be going into our relationships. We don't just jump into the deep end. We kind of want to go in slow, and we want to kind of see if everything's being reciprocated and I feel comfortable with it. And so I encourage people, kind of pay attention to your gut on that too, and go slow.
Absolutely. For those that might know Brene Brown, and if you haven't heard of her before, please check her out. She's wonderful. She does a TED Talk on vulnerability. And she really kind of said this about vulnerability, which I always really love and appreciate. It's that idea that, if we want to make that intentional choice to be vulnerable with other people, right? Trying out your little, our toes in the water, just like Brett said. It's looking for that idea or understanding that idea that this can be the safest place sometimes, that you can be afraid with me, right? And I can be afraid with you.
Kind of like what we're doing right now.
Exactly. And with all of you today too. And so, one of our takeaways for tonight is if you choose to want to take even just a small step this week with vulnerability, to just be proud, right? Be proud of how brave and how courageous you are for taking that step.
Absolutely. And hopefully you're able to see this is why we are psyched about psychology, because when we get psyched about psychology and we get to share this, being psyched for psychology really helps us understand how vulnerability can be an ally to protect us and to provide good things for us, and to know the difference and when to rely on that for one or the other.
Absolutely.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's coming up next Tuesday?
Absolutely. If you join us for our next Facebook Live session next Tuesday the 12th, again at 7 p.m., we will be joining live for a brand new topic on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and of our relationships. And we are going to be very excited to talk about that with you then, and for you to follow along with us on our audio podcast as it gets released weekly. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Good night.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.